It's funny, as you come to a conference like this, as the day goes on, your original comments, you begin to start rewriting them in light of the things that people have said at earlier panels or even earlier on your own panel to sort of try and make this a more coherent event for everybody. So I think, as I see myself now, I see myself in some ways commenting on what I think of as a changing model of public finance of elections, as I think most clearly demonstrated actually by my two predecessors up here, Nick Neihart and Fred Wertheimer, as they describe the pending proposals in Congress. You're hearing something a little different from the way public finance was described or pushed forward in the preceding dozen years or so, from, say, most of the 90s and the current decade, models of full public funding or clean elections models. And you're hearing, with greater or lesser degrees of emphasis, sort of two new developments. One is a move away from full public funding, with the assumption that the additional part, the private part, is going to be played by small donors, and the other is a move away from spending limits. And I think until this time, we have not had any public funding systems in the United States without spending limits. You're also hearing a move away from that. I want to talk today about why this is happening. I'm going to talk about two reasons. One, I'll spend more time on it, is the constitutional reason, which I think is in the background for some of this. Second has already been heavily alluded to, which is the rise of small donors through the internet. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of this, how this may change what we expect of public funding, and maybe even how we talk about what we think public funding can accomplish. First of all, looking at this, the first thing to point out is, although we talk about publicly funded elections, that's impossible. Certainly under a governing Supreme Court doctrine, you can't have publicly funded elections. The election can be funded, that is to say, the balloting process, but you can't have campaigns in which all the participants are taking only public funds. The Supreme Court has said that candidates have a right to engage in unlimited spending, so anything you do, any opt-in would have to be voluntary. Nothing can stop people from spending unlimited amounts of their own resources, such as my mayor, Michael Bloomberg. Nothing can stop people from relying heavily on bundlers to put together large amounts of private contributions. And most importantly, or comparably importantly, nothing can stop independent groups, political parties spending independently, independent committees, 527s, 501Cs. So however, any form of public funding of candidates has to be developed in an environment, in a context in which there is the potential for unlimited private funding, unlimited spending by other campaign participants, candidates and independent committees. One response to this phenomenon, which was prominent in the last dozen years or so in many of the clean elections programs developed at the state level, and New York City had something similar in its program, is to come up with some way of responding to high levels of spending by non-participating candidates, the Millionaire Model, or by independent committees. These are sometimes called rescue funds in North Carolina, trigger funds, fair fight funds. And the idea was if you had a candidate who was not participating in public funding but spending above a certain level, the public program would do something. It would lift the spending limit. It would give the participating candidate more money up to some level. And some of these programs are also designed to respond to high levels of spending by independent committees. These, I think, became critical to public funding because they were seen as an important way of dealing with the problem of unlimited outside spending. Without them, public funding could be seen as a form of unilateral disarmament. As a candidate limited to the public grant would be facing potentially unlimited opponents or independent committees. So I think this became part of the arsenal of public funding programs. Enter the Davis case, which was certainly referred to in the prior panel, but I think I wanted to spend another minute on. Davis, as you recall, was the case in which the Supreme Court struck down the so-called Millionaires Amendment. The Millionaires Amendment was a provision in BICRA that said that if a candidate is facing a high-spending opponent, a high-spending opponent relying on his own money, a high-spending self-funded opponent, that the candidate facing that opponent can obtain contributions in larger amounts than are normally allowed. And as you heard in the prior panel, people talked about how this was in this case, Justice Alito became famous for sort of removing equality as a goal of campaign finance regulation. In some ways more important was the very way in which the court framed the case. This is the first time the court has struck down a law which raised limits, which the very effect of the law was not to directly limit speech, but to actually make it easier for some candidates facing others. But the court didn't see it that way. The court framed this as a limit. The court said the very idea that it would make it easier for one candidate because of the activities of another was the equivalent of penalizing or chilling, limiting the speech of the candidate who triggered the benefit. Based on that, and the court did not directly address the public funding programs, although there was a very intriguing CF site, and lawyers know about CF sites. It's not quite clear what they mean. Until now, a number of the state trigger laws had been challenged. In every single case but one, they had been upheld. It was the but one case that the Supreme Court referenced in an interestingly obscure way, but clearly referenced that one case in which a state trigger law had been struck down. So I think Davis puts a dark cloud. It's not definitive. The court shortly after declined to take a case from the Fourth Circuit in which had upheld a similar trigger law involving North Carolina's public funding for judicial elections. But in other jurisdictions, the district court in Arizona, the state legislature in New Jersey, it's currently being litigated in Connecticut, I think it's fair to say that this is a serious cloud over the older model of public funding. And I think it may be one of the reasons, and obviously the authors of these plans can talk about why they're moving the way they're going, but one of the reasons why I think we cannot really be in a world of spending limits or be in a world of pure public funding. So long as the public grant is not unlimited, you're going to have the possibility of non-participants outflanking the publicly funded candidates. And under the model of Davis, the fact that they're outflanking cannot be the basis for providing the publicly funded candidate, clearly not with more money and possibly not even with lifting the spending limit alone. So I think that's one of the things we have to think about as we think about how to design public funding. So one of the whys, I think, for the shift in the model is Davis, and more generally the way Davis ties into the background of there's always the possibility of large amounts of spending by privately funded other participants.